Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. It was so great seeing so many of you in New York the last few weeks. I had some great conversations with a lot of you about the art world and the art market. Thanks so much again for all of your support and for listening to the podcast. With the countless auctions, the gallery shows all over the city, and by my count, 5 art fairs, it really is incredible just how much art was on view in New York. Of course, the biggest barometer for the art market is the major auctions, and we did witness some softening in the market, more so perhaps than at any time since the pandemic began. With the longest anticipated recession still forthcoming, as well as rising prices on the primary market, and just a lot of art having been acquired by collectors over the past few years, I think some collectors are starting to slow down and become more discerning, which maybe isn't necessarily a bad thing. It'll be interesting to see how the remainder of the year plays out. In this week's episode, we're joined by Judd Tully, an independent arts journalist who contributes regularly to the art newspaper. Judd joins us to help recap the past week's auctions in New York and make sense of everything that transpired. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Thanks so much for listening. Judd, it's great having you on.
Yeah, pleasure, Adam.
Absolutely. Well, it was a very fascinating auction season. I think we witnessed some significant softening in the art market, perhaps for the first time since the pandemic started. Help us put last week's New York auctions in perspective. Just how much softening did we see? What should the takeaways be from the sales?
I mean, first off, there was such a, if you want to call it an avalanche of material from modern, contemporary, very recent work. Of course, at all the auction houses. I mean, what struck me the most, and I think a lot of people were surprised, was the single owner sale at Christie's of the Gerald Feinberg collection that was, I think it was like, Art of the Century designation. And this was a, very well-known Boston-based real estate developer, hotel developer, long in the market. And so his estate was selling. And oddly, to me, incredibly, it came to market so-called naked. There were no guarantees, no third parties. It was strictly what the market would bear. And based on the expectations, which was, I jotted this down, from low to high was 163 to 235 million. And it hammered all told at 124.7 million. And it's not that things didn't sell. They just went for, at times, close to half of what the low estimates were. So there were some gasps in the room when things continued to sell. And I think it could be perhaps his taste in that it's not that it's conservative, but it's there were several journalists that covered that had never been to a sale like that. And I don't know if that set a precedent or it gave Sotheby's the next night a chance to tell their consigners, you better drop your reserves or else, you're going to be in trouble. But that was the only example of most of the other auctions were populated with either third-party guarantees or house guarantees. So basically, things were pretty much covered. And, in terms of just softening of the market, it's certainly the case from 6 months ago. But I mean, my sense is that possibly, I mean, it always eventually happens, even to the art market, that world events, economies, rising interest rates, etc., headlines about bank failures. It does have an impact and sobering sort of not a malaise really, but it's not as bubbly, it's not as fizzy. And yet, some certainly huge prices were realized. Yeah, I mean, it would be hard to say that it was a disaster. I think it's more like even pushing to, is it a correction? We'll see, down the line in November what happens, what comes up, who's selling. But, in a season like this might give pause to potential consigners when they're not estate driven and they have to sell because they have to pay estate taxes or whatever, or these sort of emergency situations where people need to raise money. So yeah, I wouldn't be totally gloom and doom about it, but I think there's a more of an awareness in the market that just, if you just throw it out, it doesn't necessarily have to sell. Or if it sells, it might go to that third party bidder who's got a financial interest, or, and the like. And I think also, and this is always, as the market post-pandemic, people getting back into some kind of groove, I think there's a bit more, maybe if you want to call it smartening of different collectors, being more picky. But again, just like a tsunami of material. I mean, one perhaps good indication of and the sale did fine. But it was Sotheby's Now evening auction that kicked off their contemporary. And, that's usually where half of the lots would be just very young or less seasoned in the auction world artists that would get 5 times what the low estimates would be. And it was, that was the case for some of the works, but there was, and one of the major lots, a Nara painting, was withdrawn at the 11th hour, and that had a $12 to $18 million estimate. So, I mean, it's just, you can't, the other, I think, pretty notable thing, which has been going on now for several seasons, and I don't even know the best way to describe it, but certainly artists of color and women artists, again, there was a lot of intense bidding on certain lots. And, not that you're, making those descriptions like somebody's from, Serbia or something like that. But, it's pretty evident that there's a kind of catching up moment in the market. You see it in museums, you see it in galleries in terms of representation. And, and that's, it's a great thing. But the top lot at again, this Now evening auction was the Kerry James Marshall piece, untitled work called Mask Boy. And while I'm just jumping around, the top lot, and it was actually the most expensive work, I believe, of the 2 weeks, was at Christie's 21st 21st Century Evening Sale. And that was a Basquiat painting that came in at 58 million hammer, 67.1 million with fees. And it was a painting from 1983 called El Gran Expect. Well, I can't pronounce it anyway. The Nile. So that, it made more than a Gustav Klimt painting. It made more than a Henri Rousseau painting. And more interestingly to me, it was last offered at auction back at Sotheby's, New York in November 2005. So that's quite a while ago, but it made at that time 4.6 million. So it's a significant appreciation, and it shows, in a part where that market is gone. And the painting was consigned. Well, it didn't say, but it was to benefit the Accademia Valentino, which is the Italian designer Valentino. That's who most likely acquired it back at Sotheby's.
Yeah, I think you raised a lot of great points about where the market is at the moment. Potentially, we have seen a correction. I agree buyers are being more discerning. They're pursuing very nice examples by artists. Look, they bought a lot of art over the last few years, and from the consignor side of things, we saw withdrawn lots just prior to the sale, meaning the consignors were unhappy with the lack of registered interest, and so they just pulled it. And then on the other side of things, you saw some artwork sell well below the estimate, which I think was because consignors reduced the reserve just prior to the sale because of lack of interest, but they chose to sell now at a discount rather than wait perhaps for the next auction season when things could be even softer. So if we dig deeper into the auctions, I'm curious from your perspective, were there weaker results across the board, or did certain types of art and at different price points perform better than others?
I believe that it just depends on the work of art that's being offered, and whatever period, whatever the provenance, whatever the background of it, I think will determine more or less its fate. I would be hard pressed, apart from, say, certain artists, I don't know, just throwing a name out, that were some seasons past were sort of, really very hotly contested, et cetera, et cetera. But someone like Stingel, maybe that market is softening. But I really don't think there's any particular sector is hurting. And I think the auction houses, and this was spoken up after the Christie sale of the Feinberg, where people were asking, like, what happened, and they pointed out, and maybe it's just a kind of a good way to spin it, but these estimates were set basically 6 months ago, and it was a different climate. And that's what they go by in terms of, what the last sale did. And, let's see what happens. So 6 months from now, I'm very sure in November that estimates will be adjusted. And perhaps, if it's not an estate sale, maybe there'll be, fewer collectors risking their works at auction.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and it touches on what you said earlier about the Feinberg estate that had no guarantees. It was more of an unmasked or a naked sale. The work sold for what the free market was willing to pay at the time of the auction. And sure, if you do that, you get all the upside and you don't have to share it with any guarantors. But the risk, of course, is that these decisions to sell, the estimates, these are all set months before the auctions, and if the sentiment or economic climate changes during that lead time up to the auction, you don't have anyone to bail you out.
Yeah, and if you were, looking at the bright side of things, those buyers at the Feinberg sale made some amazing acquisitions in terms of expectations. So, that might inspire someone. There was a Picasso that bought in at Christie's, a high estimate Picasso, but Giacometti, Gustav Klimt, Vincent van Gogh, Monet, Gauguin. I mean, there were, the market is alive. I mean, I just don't know quite how well it is.
And so as we digest these auction results and try to understand exactly why things played out as they did, I know you're speaking to a lot of insiders during and after the sales. Are there a few things they're pointing towards as to why we witnessed this softening in the market for really the first time since the first few months of the pandemic?
I don't think there was any great surprise among observers or pundits in terms of, the reality sandwich of higher interest rates and, just kind of unease about, the whole, global world situation, that even though the, war in the Ukraine is still going on after over a year, it's I mean, for instance, I didn't notice really, there was quite a bit of Asian bidding, and I think that accounted for a considerable percentage of the higher priced lots. So that's, I'm sure, making the auction houses feel, a little bit confident that sector hasn't, fallen away. But I don't think anyone would register, dismay at the results. I think it was sort of, in a way, as to be expected, and I think generally a relief that, they kind of got by. And also with the increased, buyer's premium and added on bits, the auction houses are, scooping up a few more bucks to keep them going, keep the machine running smoothly on a global plane.
I noticed that they like to tick up 1% here or there every so often. And,
it's extraordinary, really.
It really is. So, as a veteran art journalist, you've witnessed several market cycles. Obviously, you're not a fortune teller, but do you have any sense as to what comes next, usually after a soft sales season like we just experienced?
For sure, sellers are going to be, I think, more cautious coming into the fall, especially those holding, high value works. If they're not being pressured economically to, change over to sell, I think it'll be a harder sourcing season. And I know that this past season, from different auction house people across the board, from Phillips to Christie's to Sotheby's it was a hard slog getting material. And it's when in 2009, right after the crash of the fall of 2008, there was the auction houses lost tons of money because they had put in guarantees again, before the market had its big correction, and that had a big impact on their outlook going forward. In other words, that's when third-party guarantees really accelerated, and the auction houses stepped back from just putting out tens of millions of dollars in standalone house guarantees. And going further back, because I could go quite far back in the after the big boom of the late 80s in 1990, and then in 1991 the market cratered, and in a much more significant way than anything that we've seen just recently. So I think it's a different ball game really now. I mean, it's very precise in terms of the way the houses choreograph their sales, and maybe there'll be less material, and it's just dependent on estates. Like, the Cy Newhouse. I mean, that's another good example, actually. This last round, the masterpieces from the Cy Newhouse collection that was at Christie's. It did okay, but there weren't any fireworks, and you'd think with the lineup of blue chip names, it was pretty mediocre.
I think that historical perspective you shared is really interesting. I remember third-party guarantees really taking off as auction houses didn't want to carry the risk of guarantees themselves in case the economy shifted suddenly and they were holding on to these guarantees that didn't really make sense anymore with the market. And the third-party guarantor space is really quite opaque. You have different parties involved with different motivations. You have some collectors, you have some dealers, you have some investors. But given this auction season, I'm interested to see, just like we saw the auction houses reduce their guarantee exposure in 2009, if third-party guarantors will also be less active this next auction season. And if that's the case, does that translate into less art for sale in the auctions? So that'll definitely be something that we'll be monitoring. So looking forward, what are a few of the next major events in the art world you'll be observing to see how the market performs?
Well, I mean, the big next thing after the art fairs here, Frieze, New York, the Independent Fair, smaller scale, will be in June at Art Basel. And the granddaddy of the big fairs. Of course, there are going to be more auction sales in London, and that's going to be a hard act to follow. But it's remarkable in terms of the Christie's and Sotheby's having these double header sales, like two different category sales on a single night, and single owner sales on another night. I mean, it's pretty crowded, and I think there's a sort of that sort of has that possibility of causing just kind of fatigue of just trying to kind of get a sense of all of it.
Judd, thanks so much again for coming onto the podcast and helping us make sense of all of the auctions that occurred these past few weeks in New York. If our listeners don't already, they should make sure to read Judd's writings in the art newspaper and wherever else you're publishing. You can also check out Judd's website where you can see all of his writings and everything else he's up to. That's juddtully.net. And where can we find you on social media?
Well, not so much, but
Okay.
at Judd Tully. But if I could make one plug,
yes,
for
please.
my documentary film, The Melt Goes On Forever, The Art and Times of David Hammons, is playing at its final week now at Film Forum in Soho, and we'll be moving on to Santa Monica on June 2nd. And that's a documentary film about the great artist, Mr. Hammons.
Absolutely. Well, we'd love to have you back on the podcast in the future to really talk more in depth about Hammond's career and the documentary and his life. Such a important and mysterious artist. Judd, thanks so much again for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Adam.